Hey, this is Jason Kleberg from the Force 5 podcast, a show that forces a guest to come up with a movie-themed top 5 list topic, and then we reveal our picks on air. Top 5 heist films, top 5 tearjerkers, top 5 movie dogs. Every show you'll be asking yourself, what would be on my list? Guests include directors, screenwriters, actors, podcasters, musicians, authors, and even a professional wrestler. Subscribe to the Force 5 podcast, and you won't just be a listener, you'll be a list nerd. The Force 5 podcast, available wherever you're listening now.
Do you love movies? So do I. What's up, y'all? It's KB, and I love movies, inviting you to listen to The Conversation, a film podcast where passion meets perspective and opinion. From the old school to the new, I invite a guest on to discuss the movies that thrill us, challenge us, break our hearts, or even blow our minds. There's always new episodes dropping wherever you get your podcasts. So join the conversation. We don't just watch movies. We love talking about them too. The Conversation with KB Loves Movies, a part of Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Hello, this is present-day Mark Begley, bringing you a new intro to the Simon Fitzjohn on Full Circle episode. I have combined the episodes together now. I'm doing a lot of remastering of old episodes pre-2020, and it always bothered me that this was split in two. The reason they were split in two was some technical issues I was having with GarageBand at the time. The one thing that really bugged me about it was that a lot of times the second episode didn't get listened to. That may just be a matter of them being too long or people losing interest. I don't know. I think it's a fascinating story. I love all the background that Simon gives, plus his thoughts on the film itself. That's why it ended up being such a long interview. So I have tried to remove most of the instances of me mentioning that it's split in two, since that is now a moot point. And the only other thing is that even though this has been quote unquote remastered and re-leveled, I should say, Simon's end is still a little wonky, and that was just a bad Skype recording from back then when I was using that format for recordings. It is lifted up in the mix, though, quite a bit more than it originally was. So hopefully it sounds better. It's a couple hours of a great conversation with a lot of background and detail from Simon. Of course, the biggest news with all this is that the movie was finally remastered. All the rights issues were fixed. You can get it on Blu-ray. It made some festival rounds earlier in the year. Simon and I were supposed to talk in the spring, along with Richard Longcrane, and it didn't happen, I believe, just because they were too busy promoting the film. Hopefully that can happen still someday, though, and we can, or at least I can, learn what shook this loose finally so that they were able to get this done. So this goes back all the way to, I believe, September of 2019. So it still took a good 3.5 years for the re-release of the film. All right, without further ado, here is Simon Fitzjohn on Full Circle. All is one long episode now. Thank you so much for listening.
Hello, this is Aaron West. I am the author of the A24 New Wave. In this book, I look at A24's output and I make the argument that we are in a new wave movement right now. A24 plays a major role. This book has a supplemental podcast where each episode is a brief conversation about an A24 related topic, whether an actor, director, or even a genre. As I continue research for the book and conduct interviews, I expect to record podcast episodes with people involved with the company. You can find the podcast at cinejourneys.com or wherever you find podcasts, and we are proud to be members of the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Hello, and welcome to this special episode of Wake Up Heavy Recollections of Horror. I have mentioned a number of times throughout these episodes that The Haunting of Julia is one of my favorite films. It falls into that hysterical women category, the subgenre that I've so named. And a few months back, I think in June, I mentioned that I had been in contact with a gentleman named Simon Fitzjohn, who has been doing a lot of legwork and research in regards to the rights of the film. And he's doing that because he would like to see, as would many other people, the film get a proper release, a re-release onto Blu-ray, and of course possibly in festivals and other formats. So we finally got a chance to sit down and chat, and this is, for me, a very fascinating story. It's the kind of mystery that I enjoy. It's about a movie that I enjoy. It's nice to hear Simon's passion about the film and how that has come out in the research that he has done. So I hope you enjoy hearing about this. Even if it's half as much as I enjoyed listening to Simon, it'll be worth your time. So without further ado, this is Simon Fitzjohn discussing his research into Full Circle, also known as The Haunting of Julia. Well, when did you first see Full Circle?
Yeah, it's a strange one, really, because I think I couldn't tell you the exact date because it was on VHS in the early 80s when it had a very narrow release, because there was a period of time where I just had this horror awakening, if you like. My parents were big horror fans.
Oh.
They always used to tell me that they would go to horror double bills at the local cinema on Saturday evenings, before I came into their lives. And so my mum would always be telling me about these films that she'd seen. And obviously this was pre-internet, so she would give you these descriptions of what had happened because she wouldn't remember film titles. And you'd be like, right, okay. And I thought, because one, as an aside from Full Circle, one of the ones she always went on about was she talked about, there's this film and it's set in a sorority house and and the killer is in the attic and he's in a rocking chair and he's phoning the people in the house. And obviously she went, this film's amazing. And now you type that in and everybody would say, that's Black Christmas. But, back in the early 90s, late 80s, 90s, when she was telling me this, and I didn't have a clue, and I would tell people and they didn't have a clue. So that's where my love of horror came from. So I just went through VHS tapes in the early 80s, like rentals, and that's when I first saw it. But it didn't really register with me that much because, to be honest, I think I was too young because the thing that I've always thought about Full Circle is just how much of a quote-unquote adult film it is, how mature it is. You need to fast forward really to I think it was 2016, strangely enough, when the BFI here, so the British Film Institute, did a piece on their website which was entitled, the 10 best British horror films you probably haven't seen. And I thought, right, yeah, okay. I haven't seen these.
Right.
So I thought this will be tick, 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 tick. And went through them all. And it was films like Frightmare, Pete Walker's film, films like that. And I was like, yes, I've seen it. Yes, I've seen it. And then there was a picture of Mia with her arms out, at the end, Full Circle. And I thought, hang on, that rings a vague bell. But I'm not sure. Have I actually, why haven't I watched this one again? And so lo and behold, then when I Googled it, I realised why I hadn't watched it in the years since, because it wasn't available. It wasn't available, it had been deleted on VHS pretty swiftly, never come out on DVD, obviously never surfaced on Blu-ray. And so I thought, that's frustrating because I wouldn't mind watching this again. Then realised that there is this reasonable copy of it on YouTube. So I literally that night thought, right, okay, let me tick this one off the list. But I thought, I'll have it on in the background, to be perfectly honest with you, while I'm tapping away. And if I hear something happening, I'll watch and, I'll give it another rerun. And as well as I do how the film starts. It hits you over the head right in the opening scene. And I thought, wow, this film deserves my attention a little bit more here. So stop whatever I'm doing. I'm fully concentrating on this now. And I just sat there practically in silence for like the 95, 100 minutes running time. And the way the film ends, I mean, I don't know if we're going to be talking about the ins and outs of what happened in Full Circle, but I just thought, why on earth is this film not shouted about from the rooftops? and why isn't this film out there? What on earth? How has this film just been allowed to disappear? Because literally the next day I went into friends, I went to people who were film buffs, film fans, not necessarily horror fans, even some of my horror film friends, and said, Full Circle, Mia Farrow, blah, 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 glazed expressions, bemused, never heard of it. What are you talking about? And so I thought, right, I have to do something about this. This I cannot let this lie, because Peter Fetterman, who was the producer of Full Circle, he after I had a conversation with him and got things off the ground, he described me as a champion of lost films. And I thought, that's not a bad thing to be called, to be honest with you. I can live with that. And so for the last 3-4 years, obviously it's become, I think you used the term in an email to me, like an obsession, it has in a way, really. I suppose I thought, I have to do something about this. Why, when you say the words Mia Farrow horror, do people only think of Rosemary's Baby? Why is Full Circle classed as like some sort of lesser Rosemary's Baby? Or why isn't it talked about? Why isn't Mia Farrow's performance in Full Circle talked about, which is an incredible performance? Everything about it, the direction, the lighting, the soundtrack. More people seem to talk about the soundtrack than the actual film. The incredible thing here in the UK is that the actual soundtrack made more money than the film did, because it got a full vinyl release, and there's more copies of the vinyl soundtrack out there than people went to see it at the cinema over here. So, it's a strange thing, but I just thought this is it now. And I thought, obviously I had an advantage that it was filmed in London. It's a British film or British Canadian film. I live in London, I work in London, I live near London. So I had a bit of a head start, and I thought, right, I am going to spend as long as I can trying to do something about this, researching it, talking to people, trying to find out if we can re-release it in some way. And here we are, unfortunately, 3-4 years on, and it's still not re-released, but I know a lot about the film.
Well, who did you get into contact with first?
The first person I actually spoke to about it was Peter Fetterman, because I thought, right, let me just get a cast list, a crew list. Now, the obvious problem is Full Circle was filmed November-December 76, came out in May 78. In the UK, anyway. So you're talking 42 years ago, right. 43 years ago. There are sadly a lot of people that were involved that aren't around anymore. Now, but on the flip side to that, it was Richard Longcrane's second film that he made, for example. Peter Fetterman, it was his second film. And these were guys in their late 20s, 30. So they are still around. With Peter, I thought, well, I've got to be realistic here, because Richard Longcrane's still making films. I thought he's not going to want to talk to me about some film he did back in the 70s, and so I thought, but Peter Fetterman, let me Google him, and it came up that he now owns an art gallery in Los Angeles. And so I thought, oh, okay, is this the same Peter Fetterman? And looked, and it said, from the UK, used to be in films, and I thought, that's got to be the same guy. So I contacted him through his gallery website, and he emailed me back and said, sort of happy to talk about it. And nobody's really ever talked to me about this film. People never talk to me about my films anymore. And so, yeah, give me a ring. And so I ended up with about an hour's phone conversation with Peter, who was very open about what had happened with the film. I mean, he told me stuff on the phone that I'd never heard read anywhere else. Like he said, I think I put in one of my pieces I wrote about the film that they considered Natalie Wood for the part before they gave it to Mia Farrow, because they wanted an American in the lead role. So stuff like that. I thought, I don't think anybody knows that. So and then just when I was wrapping up my conversation with him, he said, "Oh, I can put you in touch with Richard Longcrane if you want." He said, "Because I'm still friends with him," and I'm like, "Yeah, okay, I can do that. I can live with that." And Richard lives in London, and so the next thing I know, I'm speaking to Richard on the phone, then going around his house, and then he's putting me in touch with Peter Hannan, who was a cinematographer, and then he knows somebody else, and they know somebody else, and suddenly I'm speaking to costume designers and prop masters, and then tracking down the cast and as many of the cast as that I can myself. I interviewed Tom Conti about his role in it, because he'd done a radio broadcast of the Murder on the Orient Express, and so I just contacted the radio production company, and they put me in touch with him. And the only person that has refused to talk to me is Keir Delay, who I got an email back from his agent that simply said he has no memories of the filming, and that was it. That was it. Mia Farrow, I've not been able to get anywhere near. She's liked a couple of my tweets, which is like, crack open the champagne when that happens. But what Richard has said is that he thinks that if we get the re-release off the ground, that he would approach Mia and say, "Look, we met at the party a few years ago," which apparently they did. They met at some sort of function a few years back, and she came over and said hello to him because she remembered him. So I thought, well, that's a positive. So rather than, this fanboy emailing her or messaging her and saying, "Can I talk to you, please?" If Richard gets in touch with her and says, "Oh, well, we're doing a re-release, can we get you involved?" Because she just doesn't really talk about her films anymore. She hasn't done a film since possibly The Omen was the last film she possibly made, because she was in the remake of The Omen.
Right.
In 2006?
Something like that, yeah.
I don't think he's done anything since then. Now it mostly seems to be charity work and protesting against Trump and sort of and sort of supporting her sons and stuff. So yeah. So that's how it happened. I think everybody was, to be honest, I think everybody was quite baffled when I sort of contacted them. Especially when you track down and somebody say, "Oh, weren't you one of the ladies that was in the seance scene in Full Circle?" And you had like one line saying like, "Oh, we wouldn't want to miss Mrs. Flood's deliberations," and it's like that. And you're like, "Yep, that's you. I want to talk to you," and so I think they found it quite entertaining when these people are being asked about a film they made like 40 odd years ago, and somebody's so passionate about it, like I am, But yeah, I mean, everybody you speak to, you get another story. Like Tom Conti told me, for example, that the scenes where he is in the Land Rover driving Mia around, when she gets out the Land Rover and runs off to the British Museum or the British Library. So for those scenes, Peter Hannan and the camera crew were actually strapped to the bonnet of the car, to the front of the car. So that's how they get the shots of them sat inside driving. So what that meant was when Tom Conti was driving, he couldn't see where he was going because the crew, the camera, was literally in front of him. And so he said they cleared a street and basically said, "Right, well, we'll just drive straight, just keep going straight, and we'll film it." And unbeknownst to them, somebody actually returned to their car that was parked and literally just pulled out. And Tom Conti just went straight into them. Literally in one of the takes, they crashed into somebody's car as they were pulling out. And I thought, well, nobody knows that, right. And I know I may be, you may argue, as most people do when I tell them, nobody cares. But for me, I'm like, well, actually, nobody knows that, And so I thought, well, that and it gives me a weird sort of like kick, to sort of have that, because I think these things should be celebrated, if they can. The first book I wrote was actually, can piece my life together here, Mark, because the first book I wrote was about Bob Clark, the director Bob Clark. Now,
Yeah, I saw that.
Bob Clark directed Black Christmas, so you can tie it right back to my mum telling me. Okay, so I can remember I tracked down a lady who played a zombie bride in Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, and her entire performance revolved around pushing a hand up out of some earth and grabbing one of the characters by the ankle, and that was it.
Right.
It was like one, and that was it. But I found her. She was working in an art gallery in New Orleans, and I remember when I contacted her, and she was like, "This is incredible. Nobody has ever spoken to me about this film." And she wrote back to me 5,000 words.
Wow.
Like of everything that happened on set. About how the special effect, the makeup was done, how this, how that, and when they went to a screening, and I thought, well, nobody's ever talked to you about this before, and I thought, how cool would it be if I'd ever been in a film like that, and 40 years down the line, somebody excitedly contacts me from the other side of the world saying, you were in a film I absolutely love, can I talk to you about it? And I think that's the attitude I've got. Everybody I've spoken to, as I say, bar Mr. Delay, everybody I've spoken to has been so accommodating.
Oh, that's good.
And Richard obviously has been pivotal to that. Richard is so modest, it's staggering. I don't know quite what I expected, but when you get invited round to a film director's, an award-winning film director's house, as he did, he said, "Oh, come round for lunch. We'll talk about it." And I was like, "Right, okay, this is a bit of a new one for me." This is when things really progressed, because I went round to Richard's house and spoke to him, and he was flabbergasted because I took all the marketing materials I've got for the film around, and I've got Italian posters and French this and French singles and pictures from America and folders worth full of stuff. And so he thought, right, well, this guy's either crazy or he's legitimate, and a bit of both, I suppose.
Right.
But then things really moved on a notch when I spoke to Peter Hannan, because Peter Hannan obviously was the cinematographer on the film, an Australian guy, and who has had a huge part in how the film turned out. Because everybody who's seen the film comments on the lighting. The sort of haze that there is about the film, how beautifully it's shot, and a lot of that was down to Peter Hannan, although again he's pretty modest. He said, well, I was just lucky with the light when we were filming, the natural light when they were in the park, Holland Park, etc., with the sun coming through the trees and all those sorts of scenes. But yeah, he just announced that one of his other films that he'd worked on was being given the Blu-ray treatment because they'd found the negative at Technicolor and the company was releasing it. And he said when he went to Technicolor to get the negative to oversee the restoration of it, they said to him, "Oh, by the way, there's another film here in our vault that's got your name on it, Full Circle." And so there it was, all 5 reels, the soundtrack, the full shebang, ready to go. And he mentioned that to Richard, who then passed that news on to me. And we're like, away we go then. There's no reason why we can't do this. And that's where I've been in limbo for the last, goodness knows how, 2-3 years now, really, because it's there. We know it's there. But basically, Technicolor have said they will not give us the negative unless we were able to definitively prove who owned the film. And this is where things have just got crazily difficult, because as you probably know, there were so many investors in this film. It was an Anglo-Canadian production. Money was being chipped in left, right, and centre by people, including Brian May from Queen, who put up some of the money for the film to be made. But some money came from Canada, some came from the UK. Peter Fetterman, the producer, said he basically had a nervous breakdown trying to get the funding for the film. And so this is the problem. There were so many fingers in the pie that trying to actually pin down, well, who owns it? Who do we need permission from to actually re-release it? And I think that's why it's never come out, because nobody has been able to answer that question. And so what I've been doing over the last few years, working with Richard, but mostly in libraries, in research libraries, at companies' house, talking to bankruptcy companies, everything else. You wouldn't believe the amount of phone calls, emails, knockbacks I've had. I have basically essentially found out who owned it. Oh my goodness, I'm having a mental block now. Who owned it? So sadly, no longer with us. Julian Melzack, who was the executive producer. So basically, Julian Melzack, he is a person, we can't thank him because sadly he died in 2016. But if he was around, Full Circle wouldn't have happened without him. Okay, for the simple reason that the weekend before they started filming, the Canadian company that were half financing the film announced they'd got cold feet and they weren't going to invest anymore. This was literally the Saturday before filming started on the Monday. So Peter Fetterman had to fly out to Canada and say, well, you can't do this. We've got everybody ready to go on Monday. And they were like, well, we can do this because we don't want to invest anymore. And so then Julian Melzack stepped in and said, I'll pay the share that they were going to pay, but you have to have me as exec producer. And I think Peter was just like, yeah, whatever it takes. So Julian came in as executive producer, and it was him that actually owned it. Now, the frustrating thing is, if anybody had been as crazy as me and 5-10 years ago done the same work that I've done on the film, this would have been out there by now.
Right. But
because I found out that he owned it, and I've got a document that says I am the owner of Full Circle, a memo from him, but because he died in 2016, I've got back into this legal minefield where I'm being told by Technicolor and Technicolor's legal team, well, he could have passed the rights on to somebody before he died. And I said, well, wouldn't there need to be paperwork for that? Because if there is, then... And their response to that is, no, you don't have to submit any paperwork to pass on the rights to somebody. You can just do it verbally if you wanted to. And as I say to Technicolor, and, this is where me and Richard get frustrated, because it's like, well, if you can verbally pass on the rights to somebody, how on earth are we going to find out if that ever happened?
Right.
But if anybody, absolutely anybody that was passionate about Full Circle, I mean, I don't think there probably are that many people out there that are as passionate as me about it, blowing my own trumpet there for a second.
Yeah, right.
But if anybody in 2015, 14, even early 2016 had tracked down Julian Melzack, he would have just been able to come forward and said, yeah, I own the rights to this. Let's get it re-released. So that's where we are at the moment. We have the BFI are going to get involved. We've got, I've had Blu-ray companies contacting myself and Richard, desperate to release it. We've got a company that's ready to do it. Peter Hanan's ready to do a restoration of it, but we just can't get our hands on the negative. And it's insanely frustrating, because I think about, last summer we thought we were there, or earlier this year we thought we were there, because I provided all this paperwork saying from Julian Melzack's company, letters and all this that I'd got from, and liquidation things of companies that oversaw Albion Films being liquidated, and and I found all the paper trail that showed where the film had ended up. Technicolor said yes, and they said, right, this is fine, we've got everything we need. We'll just need to contact you and arrange a date for you to come and collect the negative. And sort of Richard phoned me that night and sort of said, right, get down the shop and get some champagne. We're in business. And I couldn't believe it. Especially when you can imagine how excited I was, and especially when Richard said, well, I don't need this film. So he said, if it's passed over to us, he said, I'll just sign the rights to you. So he said, you'll actually own Full Circle. And I thought, just picture that for a moment, Mark, being told you actually now own the rights to your favourite film.
Wow.
I thought, could you imagine it? Could you imagine it?
I've got a couple on my list.
Especially when there's quite a lot of interest to release this worldwide, not just in the UK. You're talking US, France, Australia, so many places it's on people's wish list. And so literally, I went round to Richard's the next day, and we were, how's this going to work? And we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And then literally that night, an email popped up from Technicolor saying they changed their mind.
Oh.
Because their legal team had got involved, and they were worried that if they gave us the negative and we re-released it, that there may be somebody out there that actually does own it, and they would sue Technicolor for giving us the negative. And so that was early this year. And since then, we've just got nowhere. So that's where we stand. So it's like I've just done a stupid amount of work to try and answer every question, but it just seems as though whenever we give them an answer, they then come up with another question.
Did he have heirs? Did he have children? I watched the video that you did, and I can't remember now if that was part of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, he did. He had a daughter, who was basically estranged from him. So, because I spoke to her, Sophie. Incredibly, she was born in May 1978. The month Full Circle was released. So again, you start thinking, right, something strange is going on here. But yeah, she didn't really have anything to do with him, and she wasn't aware of the film, to be honest with you. However, what she was able to do was she was able to give me the details of the finances and the accountants who dealt with his company, because he was practically bankrupt when he died, apparently. And so she said, look, these are all the people that were involved. And so then I got in contact with them, and they were like, oh, no, it wasn't his company that owned it, because Technicolor had always insisted that it was Albion Films that owned Full Circle, because Julian had sent a letter saying, I'm the owner of Full Circle, on an Albion Films headed paper, because that was his company. However, it was when I spoke to Ernst & Young, who were the people that literally liquidated Albion Films and dissolved the company in the 90s. They said, oh, no, it wasn't the company that owned it. It was actually Julian Melzack himself that owned it, which is why he says on the letter, I am the owner of Full Circle, rather than Albion Films are the owner of Full Circle. So they said that's where Technicolor were going wrong. They're waiting for somebody to come forward that says, well, we're part of Albion Films or whatever. And it's like, it was never Albion Films' product in the first place. It was just, that was Julian's company, but he had the rights to Full Circle himself, which baffles me as to why he didn't just release it himself or re-release it, because he must have known there was interest in it. So it seems strange that he would have just sat on it. But then so many, you find this happening so often, Mark, where you sort of hear about these films and you're like, well, hang on, where's that film gone? Why did that film ever come out? And it's incredible. And just to think how many of these Full Circle type films have just dropped through a trap door in history, and nobody from our generation or younger has even seen it, let alone knowing to try and get it re-released. There must be thousands of these things out there, and I thought, well, if I can do something about one of them, I'm going to work my backside off to do something about it. If this doesn't happen, it's not going to be for the want of trying, and I mean, I'm meeting Richard again towards the end of October, because he's in France at the moment. He hops between France and the UK because he has houses there. And he said, look, when I'm back in the UK in mid-October, we'll meet up again for a coffee and see where do we go from here again. Because the current state of play, the fresh off the conveyor belt state of play, is we are probably now going to try and literally get the BFI involved to take the negative. That's where we stand as in this current moment in time, because we're thinking, well, if the British Film Institute, which is basically part funded and backed by the government, if they go to Technicolor and say, well, we'll take the negative off you and we'll store it and we'll look after it as custodians of British film, as a piece of significant British film, then Technicolor are less likely to worry about being sued if they get an institution coming forward. If you sort of understand the point I'm making there, rather than handing it over to the director and a fanboy,
right?
They're going to hand it over to the British Film Institute.
Right.
Now, I mean, the great thing is the BFI have their own Blu-ray label. flip side, where they release a lot of, and they've released quite a few old 70s British horrors in the past, and the BFI was where I saw the article in 2016 or whatever about British horrors you've never seen. So, again, there's a nice, dare I say, full circle.
Yeah.
Element to this. And
now,
so, the only problem from my point of view, sorry to interrupt, the only problem from my point of view is I would lose an element of ownership, if that makes sense. That if the BFI are involved and they're housing it and they're producing the DVD, or the Blu-ray, suddenly I'm being moved to the sidelines a little bit. Richard has said, look, whoever releases it, he would not let them release it unless they involve me, which is great when you hear somebody saying that. You think, well, that's fantastic, that he's fighting my corner. Well, he said, to put it bluntly, he said, well, you know more about this film than anybody on the planet, so why wouldn't they want to involve you in doing any special features? And to be perfectly honest with you, if the film gets released, re-released, restored, I don't really care how it's done and who does it. My mission at the start of this was more people need to know about this film. This film needs to be celebrated more. When people are talking about the best ghost stories or the best British films or Mia Farrow in films or whatever, this film needs to be up there. And so I thought, if somebody gives it the re-release and restoration, then even if I am pushed to one side, to be honest with you, I could live with it, because it would mean that the film's out there for people to appreciate.
That would be the reward.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, how did Julian Melzak, was it because of the amount of money that he put in that he ended up being the owner? I see 4 producer names on the credits. Yeah. Was it just he pitched in more money?
I think it probably is. Looking at what I know about the film, without having to being able to ask him in person, I think it is literally the fact that because he put the money in to get the film made, because it literally would have collapsed without him. As I say, Peter, said that he had to, in a panic, fly to Canada, literally days before they were due to start filming. Well, they had 2 panics, really. First of all, they had the funding being pulled out, which is where Julian Melzak, I think he basically said, right, well, I'll give you, because it was about $400,000 or $500,000 that was being put in from the Canadian side, because the budget for the film ended up at about $1 million, but literally about $400,000 or $500,000 of it came from Canada. And so I think because Julian stepped in and said, right, well, I'll give you that money, because Astral, Bellevue Path or whatever are sort of getting cold feet, I'll give you that money. However, I'm now calling the shots. And so I think it's just ended up with him, But I think that because there were other people hanging on, and because, like you said, when you look into it, there seems to be so many names and companies involved, I don't think anybody's just ever had the willpower or the patience to actually do what I've done and sort of say, right, well, let's have a look at this. And because I say, if somebody had done this 5 years ago, Full Circle would have been on the shelves. Because because either Julian Melzak would have said, yeah, I'm still the owner, what do you need me to sign? Or he would have said, well, actually, I don't own it anymore because I've now passed it on to this person. And then that person could have been contacted. Because nobody did that, it's incredibly frustrating, because Julian died sort of like about 2 months before I watched the film again. And so you think, oh, for goodness sake, if it had just literally been a matter of months earlier, we could have done something about this, but I think that's what it is. I should just say, I mentioned 2 panics there, didn't I? So the other panic was that Mia also pulled out the weekend before they were due to start filming. And this is quite an interesting story because Rosemary's Baby got its TV premiere in the UK literally the weekend before they were due to start filming, because they started filming in early November. So there was like a Halloween screening of it on the TV here, like one of the terrestrial channels. Well, there were only terrestrial channels then. So, so she was living in London at the time, obviously watched it and suddenly had this panic thinking like, I don't want to do another film where evil is involved. And so she literally phoned up Peter Fetterman on the Saturday and just said, I don't want to make this film anymore. And Peter was like, excuse me, we've got like 80 cast and crew paid, ready to go Monday morning. What do you mean you don't want to do it anymore? And so he and Richard had to go round to Mia Farrow's house because she was married to Andre Previn at the time, the music conductor.
Mm-hmm.
And the three of them basically said, no, come on, you can do this. It's not that similar to Rosemary's Baby, sort of like, and it's a great film. You like the script, everything else. And they sort of talked around. But, I remember Peter telling me, can you imagine as him as producer, who bought the rights to the book, because it was Peter who met with Peter Straub and bought the rights to the book, to suddenly be told 2 days before filming's due to start, by the way, half the money's gone and your star's just pulled out. That's the incredible thing about the making of it, really, is because it's almost like the perfect storm of what was happening to the people making the film. Okay, so you've got Mia Farrow, who at best of times is, should we say, erratic, is a way of putting it.
Mm-hmm.
Richard said the same, said she was very professional, but she was mad as a hare, was what he actually called her. And so you've got that element of it. You've got the fact that Peter Fetterman is saying on the record to me that he practically had a nervous breakdown because everything was going wrong when they were trying to get the film made. And you've got Richard Longcrane, who had spent a year working on a film called The Micronauts, this special effects extravaganza that then was cancelled. And 6 weeks later, he's on the set of Full Circle because he just wanted to make a film because he was so upset about this film had collapsed after him working on it for the best part of 18 months. And his previous project before that was a documentary about suicide and depression. You've suddenly got all these elements at play. You've got a producer having a nervous breakdown. You've got a director who said that he woke up every morning crying before he went to set. You've got a star who is volatile, who's extremely good in it, let's be honest. But she is a person very much of her own. And I think that just all molded into the film we actually get.
Right.
Because I think there were so many elements at play. Because, one of the things that struck me about Full Circle, and I don't know what it is for you, when I first, when I sat down for that version on YouTube, and I thought, whoa, hold on here, this is something else, was just how sad the film is. There's this overwhelming. I wrote a magazine piece on it for a magazine we have here in the UK called The Dark Side, which is like a retro horror magazine. I think it pops up in the US in certain bookstores and stuff over there, but it is a great magazine. And so when I said to them, can I write a piece on Full Circle? They were like, yep, go ahead. And I think I said it was almost like suffocating sadness.
Yeah.
The film it's almost overwhelming at times. The amount of times we just see Mia Farrow crying in the film. This sense of grief, guilt. It sort of taps into some real emotions, and that's before you even take the climax of the film into sort of consideration. So, I just thought, Richard said to me, he said he would, one of the things he said to me when I interviewed or when I met with him was he said he would never be able to make this film today because he's too content now. Because he said this just came at the time where just everything came together and this film happened. And it's almost magical, that it happened. You've got all these elements at play. The cinematographer saying the natural light he had on Full Circle was the best he'd had of any film he ever made. You've got Colin Towns' score, which is, I'm presuming you like it, Mark, because I've never met anybody who doesn't think the soundtrack is absolutely incredible.
I downloaded it yesterday so that I could lay it in the back.
Okay.
And I hadn't really, I've only seen the movie maybe 4 times now because it is so hard to see. I started watching it on Netflix years ago. They had it on. I don't know.
Didn't they? Yeah.
I started it and I stopped it. And I think it was another case of between the time I stopped it and went back to finish it, it was gone from there.
Okay. Yeah.
And then just kind of coming up in searches and some of the blogs that I read, that and Let's Scare Jessica to Death.
Yeah, which is another great one.
Right, which are 2 movies that I think I conflate in my head actually, and as to which one was which. And
right. Okay.
I knew the title, The Haunting of Julie. I've known it for years. I don't think I ever saw it when I was young. And so I watched it on YouTube a couple years ago and was like, oh yeah, this is very much my thing. Why isn't this available? I would search before I found this justwatch.com that will do the searching for you, I would check pretty regularly Amazon Prime, Netflix, Shudder, and all the other streaming sites, and it would never show up. And so when it did show up on Shudder, and I didn't realize that was a no-no, I watched it immediately, probably paid attention to the score on that viewing a little bit more, and was like, oh, this is really interesting. And then yesterday when I watched it, I really paid attention, and I was like, yeah, that's very much my thing too. That old analog synthesizer.
Exactly. I mean, I will happily listen to the score on its own. I'll just lay in bed and listen to the score because it just evokes all sorts of emotions in its own right. And I mean, the score is a strange one. If you don't mind, I don't know how much time we have here, Mark, and I know I'm rambling.
Oh no!
When somebody comes to me and says, "Can you talk to me about Full Circle?" I'm like, right, rub my hand. Right, how much time have you got?
We've got plenty of time.
So the interesting thing was Colin Towns wrote the score before the film was finished. Okay, because I've interviewed Colin Towns about it. Again, he lives in London. Again, the frustrating thing to just sort of segue is when you talk to people and then everybody gives me a snippet of information and I think, oh, damn you, I wish you hadn't told me that because now you're going to lead me off in another path where I've got to track that down. So for example, Colin Towns got approached by Peter Fetterman before they'd even shot the film to do the music for the film. Because Colin Towns had done some stuff with Deep Purple, the band. I don't know if you know, and he'd done other bits and pieces, but he was just starting to do some stuff solo and etc. and talking about getting into films. So Peter Fetterman met him by chance when he was at a record company about getting funding for the film. And so he said, right, here's the script. Take a look at the script and then come up with a bit of music that fits this script. Colin Towns went away. And he said he used a garden shed as a studio, literally in a place called Maidstone, which is literally next to where I live. And sort of said he just knocked out this piano tune onto cassette and then gave it to Peter Fetterman and said, right, what do you think of this? And it was like the Full Circle theme, if you like. And Peter Fetterman listened to it and said, oh my goodness, how have you done this? And then Peter Fetterman took that cassette around with him to play to people to say, right, this is the script, this is the music. Do you want to invest in this? So literally it was, and Mia Farrow signed on because she listened to the cassette of Colin Towns' soundtrack.
Wow.
So she said, as did Richard. Richard Longcrane said that Peter met him and said, well, we've got the script and I've already got some of the music done. And Richard said when he heard the music, he thought, there's a film here. The actual words he said was he listened to the music and he said, as light went off in his mind, he said, there's a film here. We can do this. And Mia Farrow was the same. Said he was undecided. And they said, right, well, listen to this bit of music because this is going to be the main piece of music in it. And she was like, right, okay, where do you want me to sign? I'll give you 6 weeks. And so, again, you can argue that just how pivotal Colin Towns was.
Right.
But the frustrating thing is that Ted said to me he did some demos as well that were on the cassette and they've just got lost. That he gave them to Peter Fetterman and he said, oh yeah, they must have been around somewhere. But he said they never ended up on the soundtrack. And so it's probably been binned. And I thought, you can't say to me, that you've done something and that it's been binned, because do you realise how many sleepless nights that's going to cause me? Just like when I found out that there were scenes that were deleted from the film after it was screened in Cannes in 1977. And then even worse, when I found a photograph of one of the deleted scenes, which is Keir Delay playing backgammon in a sort of a gentleman's club. And then Lily, his sister, comes to see him. It says it's a scene that was after the séance. So you have Lily goes to the séance and sees that Mark's around near Julia's house, and that they're quite cosy. And so then Lily goes to see Magnus at this gentleman's club and says basically, what are you doing sitting here playing backgammon and drinking scotch? Do you realise that this guy's taking your wife away? You need to do something about this. And that's when then suddenly Keir Delay or Magnus turns up at Mia's house prowling around, etc., etc. and that scene got cut after Cannes, and so that footage is probably gone. If it was happening today, that would be on digital somewhere, and somebody be thinking, right, we need to keep this for the Blu-ray, etc. But that version of Cannes, nobody will probably ever see it again,
Right.
and to roll that back to the soundtrack, the point what I made about Colin Towns writing the soundtrack before the film was finished and released is, if you look at the soundtrack, I think it's track 6 on the soundtrack or something like that. It's called Love Scene. Now, you tell me where there's a love scene in Full Circle, Mark, or the version that you've seen.
Right.
Okay, and that's because it was cut. There's a scene of Julia and Mark, a very tame love scene, because I've seen the original script. So I've seen what it was. Mm-hmm. I've seen the script that was dated the week before filming started, and it's stuffed with pink pages. But again, there is loads of stuff in that Richard just said, look, they filmed stuff, they deleted it. Some stuff they were saying like almost on the day, no, that's not going to work, forget that. But the love scene did get filmed. And so this was a scene, it's a scene, in fact, it was the first scene that was filmed. It's Julia, one of the times when Julia goes to Mark's antique shop, and goes to see him there, and she's upset, and the seance has happened, and she's tried to track down, and she's found out about there's a boy and a child and all this, where everything's still up in the air, and things develop from there, should we say. And suddenly they're in bed, and Mark tries his luck, and basically Julia says, I'm sorry, I can't do this. I can't do this. There's a bit of kissing, and then she says, no, I'm sorry, I can't do this. This is not the time or the place. And he says, oh, that's fine. Sorry to push you, sort of thing. But that went, but it got filmed, because when I interviewed Tom Conti, I said, what do you remember about the film, Tom? And he said, I remember I was in bed with Mia Farrow. That was literally the first thing he said to me when I asked him. So again, that went, but it's on the soundtrack. If you look at the vinyl soundtrack to it, there's a track called Love Scene. Because I can remember the first time I spoke to Richard about this, I said, well, I think there was bits that were cut out the film, and he was like, no, nothing was cut out the film. As far as I know, we didn't film anything that wasn't used. And I was like, well, let's have a look at the soundtrack here, Richard. I said, there's a track here called Love Scene. And I said, I don't think there's a love scene in there. And then suddenly he started to piece things together, and started to sort of remember things, I suppose, because I have to admit, when I'm doing these people, if somebody said to me, Mark, I don't know what it is for you, if somebody said to me, tell me what you did on January the 6th last year.
Right.
Like, right, okay. I can't help you, I'm afraid. And I'm phoning up people and saying, right, come on now, 43 years ago, you spent one day filming on Full Circle. I want to know exactly what happened. What did Mia Farrow say to you? What was Richard like? And you're like, well, come on, let's be honest here. How much are these people going to remember?
Right.
But everybody has something to say. Everybody tells me something. Like the prop master, Brenda Roberson. She sent me a crazily blurred photo of them setting up the afternoon tea scene, where Julia meets Lily and has afternoon tea with her in the orangery in Holland Park, where she basically says, look, I don't want anything to do with Magnus anymore. I'm in my own house now. Leave me alone. And, Brenda, the prop master, just said basically all those cakes were for real, that they had on the table. And when they stopped filming, Mia just boxed them all up because she took them home for her kids, and it's just, again, just little, you could just get drip fed little things like this. And I thought, well, no human being should ever know as much about a film as I probably know about Full Circle, because it's madness. But equally, I love it, and to be able to come and talk like this to you, and hopefully people will listen to it, and it might inspire somebody else to say, well, I've never actually seen Full Circle. What is this? What is this Full Circle that they're talking about, or The Haunting of Julia? Because what I have found, and you will find this, Mark, is there are a lot of people, the vast majority of people you mention this to, they don't know what you're talking about. But the people that, when you do mention it to them and the light goes on, they generally tend to love it. Mm-hmm. There's so many people that have come forward to me, like when I got the Twitter account set up, for example, that are like, Full Circle's my favourite film. Full Circle's one of my favourite films. Oh my God, I love The Haunting of Judy. The people that have seen it and like it really cherish it. And so it's great to have these people supporting me, when I'm, because there are times when I get down about this, when it's with that technical a knockback, that was a knockback, to go from literally sitting in Richard's house with him saying, right, I'm going to sign the rights over to you, to literally the next morning being told, sorry guys, it isn't actually happening. That was a crushing blow. And I had to take a bit of a step back at that point, because I just thought, right, this is actually affecting my mental health now, because I'm just going through such an emotional whirlwind with this film. But I just can't leave it alone. It just means too much to me, really. And I'll just find something, and then something else will pop up on an auction site, and I'm like, oh, I haven't got that. What's that? And it's some Italian poster. I haven't seen that one before. And then you have to downplay how much you like it, though, because I think if people get wind that you're like this obsessive about it, suddenly the price starts creeping up, and so you did the asking price. So, I mean, I will just work on this until either two ways, really, until either it gets released or I'm no longer here.
Well, hopefully it's the former.
Hopefully it's the former. And I did say to my wife jokingly, I said, if I die before you and Full Circle's back out there, then make sure it goes on my tombstone. By the way, this was the guy that got Full Circle re-released, because I think if it does happen, because obviously the BFI, if it does get re-released and restored, they want to actually screen it at the BFI. So, so not just a Blu-ray release, but they actually want to screen it in one of their big old screens here, and what's great is if that ever was to happen, everybody I've spoken to about this, whether it be Colin Towns, Tom Conti, Richard, etc., have said, well, if this does happen, then just tell us and we'll come along.
Yeah, that's
so
great.
You suddenly have this mega screening where you'd have directors, cast, producers, props people, wardrobe people, and I'm thinking, like, I can't even think how much that would mean to me if it actually happened, to actually, to be there and say, well, this has happened because of me, and I know, again, that sounds a bit egotistical, but it's just like so much hard work has gone into this. I joked with somebody that one of my friends who has helped me along the way with this is a sort of lady called Anya, who lives in California. Actually, she writes and does stuff for Fangoria, sort of stuff like that, and she is a huge fan.
I've seen her.
Anya Stanley.
Yeah, I've seen her tweets or retweeting and comments on her tweets.
She's been a massive supporter of what I'm trying to do, because it's one of her favorite films, and. There's so many people like that involved, and you sort of think, well, these people will know the work I've done. I sent her a little gif of, I said it reminded me a bit of, do you know going off on a tangent here, the monorail episode of The Simpsons,
yes.
Where Leonard Nimoy saves the day, and then he comes forward and says, oh, my work here is done. And I think that one of the characters said, what do you mean your work's done? You didn't do anything. And it was like, didn't I? And then he dematerializes, and I thought that will be me. If the BFI release it and make it out, the BFI are re-releasing it, I shall stand there and do my Leonard Nimoy monorail, my work here is done speech. But to be honest, I mean, if it gets released, I really, really wouldn't care who got the credit for it, because I would know. And Richard would know.
Right. I think you would have people championing you for that as well.
Yes.
So I don't think Richard Loncrane or Peter Finneman will just say, oh yes, thank you.
Yeah.
We did it all ourselves or anything like that. BFI might, but I think you have the important backing there.
Hello and welcome to Tumbleweeds and TV Cowboys. My name is Hunter. In this podcast, I'll be joined by a different guest each week to discuss a classic Western movie or TV show. I've been a fan of classic Westerns for as long as I can remember, and in recent years, they've become very nostalgic for me. I love the aesthetic, the tropes, and I love seeing different filmmakers' takes on them. At their best, they're incredibly entertaining, rewatchable, and some of my all-time favorite movies are Westerns. We'll mostly focus on Western movies made in Hollywood, but we'll also be covering spaghetti Westerns, and one thing I'm very excited to get into are Western TV shows. I've got some amazing guests coming on the show, film professors, historians, and podcasters. And Tumbleweeds and TV Cowboys is part of the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network, and many guests on the show will be from other shows on the network. Thanks for listening.
I'm not going to do much chit chat here at the beginning, except to say that I messed up on Peter Fetterman's name. I was getting Fetterman and Hannon confabulated in my head, and I created a new name. So without further ado, enjoy the second half. I had a question regarding the cut scenes. Those are the scenes, as I was watching it yesterday, I thought how different it was from the book. The main difference that I noticed was that we are focusing solely on Julia in the movie. There are not these scenes of Lily and Magnus talking, Lily and Mark talking, Lily, Mark, and Magnus, or, Magnus and Mark outside of Julia, which happens a lot in the book. And so I wonder if that was maybe, kind of the reasoning for cutting a lot of that out, especially something like the backgammon scene or the... Yeah,
I think there's a very simple answer to a lot of this. And I don't know if you're aware of this, Mark, or if the people listening are aware of it, but Richard did not like the book. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's the simple thing.
Peter I think I've read that. Yeah,
Peter did. So Peter Fetterman got like an advance copy of the book, read it before it was published, didn't like horror, didn't like supernatural stuff, Peter, but said that this actually sort of slammed him in the gut. And he said, well, if this is affecting me and I don't even like horror, this is going to affect people that do like horror. They're going to love this. So he went and met Peter Straub and got the deal, I think, for £500, I think, for the rights for the book, because Peter Straub at that point wasn't particularly well known. I think it was his second novel, I think. And so, but then Richard got the book and didn't like it. I think he said there were too many contrivances, and so he said, and as did Mia actually, that they would only come on board if the script differed quite a bit from the book. Because the original version of the script was written by a guy called Harry Bromley Davenport.
I was going to bring that up.
Exactly. So when it was originally written, the first version of the script was called The Link. That was the first version of the script, and that was pretty much what the book is as a script. Pretty much stuck identically to it. Okay, so that was The Link, and that was what was shown to Richard and what was shown to Mia, and they were both like, no. We're not having this. We want it to be more ambiguous. We want it to be more led around Julia. We want it to, so the audience has to basically make up their mind. Is she being haunted? Is she possessed? Is she suicidal? Has she gone mad? They didn't want the audience to be spoon-fed. And so it went through various rewrites by a guy called Dave Humphreys, who has worked on numerous other films, and sadly he's not around anymore. And it got changed from title to title. It went to When the Wind Blows, which is a strange one. That's what the actual script that I read, that was dated a week before filming started, was still called When the Wind Blows. And somebody had literally crossed it out and wrote Full Circle above it, because that was a reference to in the book, where they said that when Olivia was around, you had this sense that there was this breeze that sort of signified that Olivia was around. That this sort of chill, if you like. So I think that's where the When the Wind Blows title came from. And then eventually we went to sort of Full Circle. But yeah, Richard didn't like the book, so he said there has to be changes here. Because you've read the book, and I imagine some other people have. So in the book, for example, some people may not be aware of, but in the book, for example, Magnus and Mark, so Mia's husband and then Mia's best friend, they're brothers. Or he's an adopted brother, isn't he? He's an adopted brother, so he's like an outsider, but he is a brother. You have this, what I think is faintly ridiculous element of the book, where Olivia turns out to be Magnus's daughter,
Right.
Because Magnus in the book is about 30 years older than Julia.
Right.
Whereas in the film, they're relatively the same age. And so you get this situation where Magnus used to go and it was like when he was a student, got mixed up with this socialite who lived in the house that Mia moves into. And I thought, come on, this is just a bit ridiculous.
Right. One of those contrivances, like you said.
Exactly. There's too many coincidences.
Yeah.
Here. Yeah. And so I think Richard was like, right. And I think in the book as well, Mark and Julia do have a relationship in the book. And so I think Richard was like, no, we're not having this, and we're going to change this and keep changing it. And I think the problem that they had was the film that Richard wanted to make and Mia wanted to make was different to what the producers wanted to make. And by the producers, I mean one gentleman in particular, Alfred Parisa, who was a Canadian producer, who had produced like Cronenberg films and The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane, the Jodie Foster.
That's one of my
film.
favorites.
So Richard, I can tell you now, if you ever get to speak to Richard, he will not have a nice word to say about Alfred Parisa, or Alfred Piranha, as Richard calls him, because Alfred had come over with this. The Omen had just come out. And so all was in vogue was these splashy horror films with these set piece deaths. And that's what he wanted Full Circle to be. Whereas you suddenly had Richard and Mia saying, no, we want a serious film here where it's psychological and the audience needs to make up their mind what's happening. And so they ended up with this weird slight compromise where suddenly you get Tom Conti's death, which is a set piece sort of death, isn't it? If you see what I mean, where you get the lamp falling in or the fan falling in the bath, etc. And Mrs. Rudge, for example, when Julia visits Mrs. Rudge at the end at the sanitarium. In the original version of her death in the script was that she was going to be minced by an industrial lawnmower, and when Mia meets her and sort of says, can you tell me about your daughter? And she was like, evil never dies. And Kathleen Nesbitt gives this brilliant speech where that's one of the key things of Full Circle. I think there were so many great minor roles in it, where you have these little cameos by when Julia goes to visit these people. And the scenes are brilliant. Like when she meets David Swift in it, the alcoholic in his like sort of tenement building and he's saying about what Olivia was like and the things she made them do. And it's so tense and it's just dialogue, and it's the same with when Julia visits Mrs. Rudge at the end and she's saying, I choked the wickedness out of her. You killed your daughter. Evil never dies. I'm the one that's dead, and it's just incredible scene. But yeah, the original version for that was that it was filmed outside in the grounds of the sanitarium and Mrs. Rudge had a Zimmer frame that she was walking around with rather than in a wheelchair, and Mia does the turn, when Julia turns and looks at her and she has like Olivia's eyes, she suddenly reels, Mrs. Rudge loses her footing, rolls down this bank with a Zimmer frame straight into the path of this huge lawnmower that's cutting the grass of the grounds, and she just gets chewed to pieces. And I remember Richard saying, he said, well, this is just ridiculous. I said, how can you take a film seriously when you've got somebody being minced by a lawnmower? And so they just went back and forth, Richard and Alfred Parisa, all the time. Like every night. I don't mind. Do you mind me telling you these stories? I know I'm
not at all.
Saying a lot here. So there's one that literally the first scene, the choking scene. Okay. You have the scene where, Mia Julia is holding Katie, and then Magnus is on the phone to get the doctors, and he turns, and Julia's got the knife in her hand. There isn't time. I've got to cut it out. There isn't time. You don't see anything. You know what she's doing, but you don't see anything. There's no let's have a nice close-up of her throat being cut. You don't need to see it. You know what's happening. And I thought straight away, this is something that's pitched a little bit above. This is not an exploitation film. This is something that is something a bit cleverer than that. But that's not what Alfred wanted.
Right.
So literally, when they were filming that, and Richard and Peter were laying on the ground for one of the shots because they had to, have a handheld camera looking up at sort of Mia and Sophie Ward because she's holding her.
Mm-hmm.
Alfred Parisa comes over, the producer, with this huge cup of stage blood and just throws it over them. Literally throws it over them. And Richard said that he was sat on the floor with the camera, behind the camera, and suddenly he said there was just blood everywhere. Over Mia, over Sophie Ward, over the camera lens, over him, over Peter Hannan. And it's like, what on earth's going on? And he said Mia apparently just started screaming and ran off the set. And he's like, what on earth? And Alfred Parisa said he wanted to, quote, liven it up, and it's just like, this isn't what we're trying to do. They were saying, this isn't a bloodbath. That was what Richard said to me. He said the problem was he and Mia wanted to make a psychological horror, and Alfred Parisa wanted a bloodbath. And he said that was the problem. And so, and I thought, right, well, this could just be a clash of personalities here. Maybe I'm taking Richard's side because he's been so nice to me, sort of, etc. And so when I spoke to Peter Hannan independently, I said, Richard has mentioned a few things that, Alfred, there was a few issues with Alfred on set. And Peter Hannan straight away said, that we had a real problem. He said, literally on the first take we did of the choking scene, he threw blood over everything. Mm-hmm. And I thought, right, okay, so that did happen then. And one of the guys I spoke to was a guy called Ron Wiseman, who was the original editor for the film. He lives in Toronto, I think. He's Canadian, because part of the deal with it being an Anglo-Canadian film, they had to have a percentage of Canadian casting crew. So Keir DeLay counted as Canadian. Robin Gamble, who was David Swift, counted as Canadian. The producers were Canadian. It was edited in Toronto. So Ron Wiseman was the editor of the film, the first editor of the film. And what I found fascinating about that was Richard brought him over for filming because he wanted Ron on set while they were filming so that Ron could pick up the vibe of the film. So when he was editing it with Richard, he knew the tone of what they were going for. And I thought, well, that's interesting because I haven't really heard of many directors that literally have the editor on set with them while they're filming. And I thought, well, that's a new way of doing things. I thought, but actually it makes sense. If there's a very specific tone you want from the film, we'll have them there when you're making it.
It could also help with coverage, like, you're going to need a shot there to fit in between this edit.
But Ron said to me that he would say literally every night, because he was obviously staying in a hotel in London, he said every single night he would be in the room with Richard in the hotel and Alfred would come in and they would have blazing rows every night about that Alfred wasn't happy that the film wasn't fast enough, it wasn't gory enough, and they would have these blazing rows. And what Ron said to me was, he turned around to Alfred and said, look, you just need to shut up and let these guys get on with their job, because he said these guys know what they're doing. You don't realise how good this could be. And he said Alfred Parisa never said a word to him after he said that to him.
Surprising that they didn't go back and do reshoots and try to get...
I think they didn't have the money. They didn't have the money. They didn't have the time because the Canadian investors, it was like a tax write-off for them, the money.
Right.
So the Canadian investors put up the money that said, in order for us to give you the money, you have to guarantee this film is finished by end of year. So end of 76. Now they didn't. The first day of filming was November the 8th, and they had to guarantee that the film was completely finished by December the 31st. So 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and so this was what Richard said was another one of those factors where you have this emotion on the set, because he said nothing could go wrong. You couldn't afford for anything to go wrong. You couldn't afford for somebody to be ill. He said if you had Mia Farrow had been ill for a period of time, he said they'd have been in serious trouble, because it was like they wouldn't have been able to get it finished. And for tax reasons, they had to have it finished. So that was it. And I think everybody then moved on to sort of different things. And but I know what you mean. I think the only thing that changed is that the film got cut again after Cannes, because the massive difference, which we haven't mentioned, of course, is that in the original cut of the film, Magnus doesn't die. That is the massive difference.
And he doesn't die in the book.
He doesn't die in the book. Literally
and does Mark die in the book?
I think he does.
I read it a couple months ago in prep for this.
Read it again. What I do enjoy about the book is it's great, I think, to read the book after you've watched the film, because it gives you all this extra character.
Mm-hmm.
Like, one of the things that annoys me about the film is where you see people, not about the film, but about people's reaction to the film, is you see people sniping, oh, well, hang on, how come Julia's just bought a new house, when she's just come out of hospital?
Right.
And I'm like, you heard the scenes in the first scene, where Magnus comes down and says, can you sign this so I can get money out of your trust fund?
Mm-hmm.
Can you put your signature on this? And, you heard that, right? Because that tells you that she's got a lot of money, right?
Right.
But in the book, you find out that her dad was some sort of like railroad tycoon or something like that slightly dodgy character, but that he was very wealthy, which is how she had got the money, and you get these little bits and pieces. I think in the book, Mark is like an English teacher or a professor or
he's a professor
lecturer, I think, isn't he, rather than an antique dealer. But you get these little bit of detail. But I think if my memory is certainly right, literally the last page of the book is Magnus seeing Olivia. I think, like, he looks out the window and he sees Olivia across the street staring back at him, I think, and because they've rubbed it. Because I think the book slightly messes with the timelines, doesn't it? That you don't know at the start that Julia was involved in Katie dying, I think. And
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, it's only about 2/3 of the way through that they say, look, wake up, you do remember what happened, Julia, whereas in the book, it's like, bang, there you go.
Yeah, I was going to mention that because when I read it, I had seen the movie already, and I thought, oh, we're not supposed to know that she's the one that killed her.
Yeah.
Or was responsible for that, and how
don't say killed her, Mark, because I'll have issues with you if you say killed her. Yeah.
It's a twist in the book. You're led to believe that it's Magnus the whole time, or she, from her point of view, Magnus is the one that did this. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. And had to think about which I preferred.
I think you're right. What you mentioned earlier, though, is that the film definitely takes the point of being much more Julia-centric. That the film is about her. And I think, and her reactions to what happened, her trying to piece her life back together, then her obsession with, and what I find, what I love, I can't say what I love because I love so many elements about Full Circle, but another one of the reasons why I love it is that it follows conventions to an extent, but it plays with the conventions at the same time. So, you have this element in the film, which I find fascinating, that Julia wants to help the ghost. She wants to help Olivia, until things get out of hand, at the end. But she is trying to help her, to find out what happened, and there's this magnificent moment in the film, which I'm not aware of any other film doing this, any other supernatural film. There'll be people out there listening to this, and they're probably screaming, saying, but what about, because they've probably watched more supernatural films than me. So I just put my hands up and say, I was wrong, guys, I apologize. But there's the scene where Julia is in bed and she can sense that Olivia is outside her bedroom door. There's the light under the bedroom door, and any other film, that would be some tense music, some uneasiness, Julia pulling the blankets over her face, or there'd be some scare element of it. And instead you just get Julia just sort of says, oh, don't be frightened, and just sort of turns over and goes back to sleep. And I thought, whoa, you're messing with me here, because that's not how it's normally done.
And there would be a shadow under the door and a sting on the soundtrack. Exactly,
and I pointed that out to Richard, because I zipped through a few scenes with him, and I said, look, tell me about this. And he said, oh yeah, he said that was something that was deliberately we wanted to do. He said, my idea was take every way that these films were normally made and then flip it around. And I thought, right, okay, and I thought there was just so many elements like that in the film, and we haven't even got to talking about the end yet, which, if you speak to Full Circle, I speak about Full Circle to people, the people that have seen it, the people that love it, they'll generally say it hits them over the head at the start, the soundtrack, and the ending. They're normally what people say when you say and because the ending is just I don't
Sorry,
know.
that was my dog.
That's fine. No, that's fine. I mean, the ending is whatever emotion you want to put in, really upsetting, moving. I mean, it's logical in a way, but it's still unexpected. It's just. I mean, I don't know how much, as I say, you're going to say on this, or you want to give away on this, because I think part of the, the pleasure to be taken from some of these films is if you go into them not knowing everything that's going to happen.
Right.
If it makes sense. So I'm happy to sort of just say,
it is a 42-year-old film, so I'm not.
True.
It's not widely available, but generally on the show, it has a general spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Because I generally talk about much older films. We don't have to maybe lay out exactly what happens, but.
No. But as I say, when it ends, you realise, oh, right, okay, I sort of understand where you've gone with this now.
Right.
So, yeah. As a matter of interest on the filming of this, Mark, here's a nice bit of trivia for you. How long, so literally the final shot of the film, the final moments of it, how long do you think that took them to film, of the panning around the chair? How long do you think that took them to film?
3 days.
No, not bad. Well, not less than that. 15 hours. 15 hours. Yeah.
I thought I'd shoot high. I had a pretty good idea that it was.
Hours. Yeah. Of Mia sat in the chair.
Wow.
So, but it's an incredible ending, and that's when the soundtrack comes in as well. And what's interesting about the ending is that one of the things I asked Richard about, and again, because he is the type of person he is, he was straight away like, no, that wasn't me. That was Peter Hannan's idea. Was to black out everything in the background. So, when she's sat in the chair and then it closes in on her, literally everything around and behind her just goes blank.
I really noticed that yesterday on the rewatch.
And Richard said, no, that was Peter Hannan's idea. He just said, look, let's just literally fade everything out to nothingness so that the only focus is on Julia in the chair. And, that she's almost gone into not gone into a different dimension, but that it's that she's hovering in some sort of space separate from everything else that's going on. So I thought, well, if you're crediting people, then that just shows the type of person Richard is. Really, that rather than that was me, he's everything he says about a team, because what you'll find with Richard's work is he had the same people working with him on so many of his films. Like the one film he made before Full Circle was a film called Flame with a glam rock band from the UK called Slade, which is actually a really good film. And again, it's another film that you sit down and think you're going to watch a sort of film, because Slade were this sort of like fun-loving, not a gimmick band, but like a glam rock, a band in the 70s, and yet they make this film where they're playing a band, not themselves. They're playing a band, and it's this really gritty film about how it's difficult for this band, and they're being ripped off by producers and their manager, who's Tom Conti in the film, and who's trying to exploit them, and then they have arguments and the band splits, and it's a completely more serious film than people think it's going to be. And again, but again, the people, the cast, the crew for that were pretty much the crew that worked on Full Circle and then worked on other Richards films, and because he said it was very much a team effort. Everybody I spoke to said they absolutely loved working with Richard because he would get them involved. He would actually ask them for help. He said Brenda, even the prop master, Brenda said, she would say, well, have you thought about doing this? And he'd be like, actually, that's a great idea, rather than who the hell are you?
Right.
And so he said everybody would say that they wanted to work with him, wanted to work for him, so that, when he came calling and said, oh, well, we're doing another film next year, they'd be like, right, when do you want me? Because he created this atmosphere on set where it was a team effort. I think he said to me that he literally got, because everybody was almost not making it up as they went along, but it was such a rush and things were changing so much on the film, he said he had a T-shirt printed that said something like, don't rush me, I'm thinking, that he wore on set. And I think what he said to me was, he said, people will follow you, and they will go with what you want as long as you don't bullshit them. basically. He said, if you bullshit them and sort of say, I know exactly what I'm doing, I'm totally in control, I know everything.
Right.
Then he said, that's when people just won't get on with you. But he said, if you say, well, give me a bit of time here because I've got to work this out. I haven't actually got this sorted yet. He said people will respond a lot better to that, or they did to him when he was like that anyway. So, everybody I've spoken to, they can't praise Richard enough. And, having met him and, to call him a friend, that I have for the last 2.5 years is, I know exactly where they're coming from, because it's like you have to keep reminding yourself when he's inviting you round his house for dinner and stuff. That you think like, hang on, you're a guy that won awards. You're a guy that Spielberg said was a great director. You're a guy that's worked with Harrison Ford. And what am I doing around your house? Interestingly, I don't know if you've seen my pictures on Twitter. The jukebox in the film, Mark's jukebox. He plays Speedy Gonzales at. That's at Richard's house.
Oh. I think I did see that.
Yeah, Richard has that in his bedroom.
That's awesome.
Sadly, not much else exists because, again, he tells me these things, and then I'm like, you can't tell me this, Richard. Like, apparently they had, in his words, at least 6 of the clapping clowns dolls, because originally it was a monkey,
right?
Like a clapping monkey, and then it was Richard that said, no. What we need is a clown because clowns are scarier than monkeys. Yeah. And so they said they ripped all the hair off the doll, repainted it as a clown, and it works great, doesn't it? The image, one of the posters I've got is just Mia holding this clown doll, and it's just fantastic. It's just a fantastic image. And again, that's another one of those motifs in the film where she gets her finger cut by the doll when she's putting it down. When she first holds it in the new house. And you think again, how many scenes are there where Mia is cut, where she has blood on her hands, where she is washing blood off her hands, washing blood off her clothes, and you think, okay, so there's these subtle motifs, if you like, that just pile up because there's so many of them that tie in with the whole grief, guilt, right? Parental grief, because there was a period of time, wasn't there, where you had things like Don't Look Now and film, which is another film that always gets referred to. There's another podcast, I'm not going to name it because I don't do that, but there's another podcast I enjoy listening to, and they did a whole episode on how amazing Don't Look Now was, and then compared it to some other films without mentioning Full Circle. And I thought, well, hang on. And so I contacted them and I said, look, everything you've said about Don't Look Now and The Changeling, that was it, the George C. Scott one. I thought everything you say about those films is right because those films are great. But you can't not mention Full Circle because that's the same theme, And they were jokingly emailed back and said, because I used my Full Circle Twitter account to tweet them about it, and they tweeted back and said, something tells us you might be a bit biased. And I thought, you've got me there. But what was with The Changeling, this was another funny moment, was Richard never heard from the film. Richard is not a horror fan in the slightest, which was interesting because he said after Full Circle, all the scripts he was being offered were horror films. And he was like, no, I'm done. I'm not doing horror. That's not what I wanted to do in the first place. It's just sort of fell in my lap because I needed to make a film. And I said, have you heard of a film called The Changeling, by the way, which came out about 3-4 years after Full Circle, 1980, I think, on The Changeling, possibly. And he said, no, never heard of it. And I said, right, well, let me just give you the summary of it. So you've got a parent whose child dies in the opening scene of the film, then they move into a new big house and they have a seance. And then there's some creepy stuff happens in the house and they realise that there's a ghost in the house. And he's like, Richard was like, what are you talking about? That's Full Circle. And I was like, okay, funny you should say that.
And I never really made that direct comparison between the two.
I know The Changeling goes off on a tangent towards the end, doesn't it? Obviously, because things start getting political and everything. But if you whittle it down to the essence of the film, it's pretty much the same. It's pretty much the same.
See, that's the kind of stuff that I miss until like maybe 10 watches of something like, this is basically the same story. I had a thought about the end. In the book, it seems to me they make more of, whether Julia is crazy it's not. It doesn't seem like it is expressed as much in the movie.
Right.
Maybe that's because we're from her point of view for most of it. You don't ever really you don't question as much, is she really seeing this girl or not? And they make a lot more out of it. So I think that's why, for me, the end was a little more shocking. Like, I didn't get that ideation from her through a lot of the film.
Right.
Like she seems in the book like she's really struggling a little bit
she
more.
seems a bit more unbalanced. There's a lot more like, oh, this woman's crazy.
Right.
In the sort of book, and the family members treat her as such.
Right.
Whereas in the film, you're right. It's a bit more of almost like a mystery in the film, isn't it? Where it's her like trying to piece the jigsaw together of what happened, and then when she puts the final piece in, she then realizes she probably shouldn't have started making the jigsaw in the first place.
Right.
But yeah, it is. Yes, you're right. Because I mean, even though Richard said, well, when we were making it, we wanted it to be ambiguous, and the audience to say, is she crazy? Is she suicidal? And I thought, well, I've watched it, goodness knows how many times, and I have never watched it and thought, oh, is Julia crazy?
Right.
And so you're right. I agree with you on that. It's like when she sees Olivia, when she sees Olivia, like at the school, and then she sees her in the park, doesn't she? And I've just taken it as read that she's there. She's seeing her. She's there. You don't question it. And then that's when, because Full Circle is not a perfect film. I'm not going to come on and say it is a perfect film. There are still elements where you think, well, hang on, how does that work? Because the way I have always read it is that Julia is in effect, she is possessed. That's the way I've always thought it, because that seems to be the logical way if you piece it together, where, because when she goes to see David Swift and he says, oh, what Olivia made you do was she made you kill an animal. That was your initiation with her. And I was like, right, okay, so that goes back to the turtle pit.
Oh, yes.
In the sand pit, where suddenly she's there with this dead tortoise and a scalpel in her hand. And he's like, how did this happen? That's for your initiation. That's Olivia basically taking you over, and you're now part of Olivia. And I thought, right, so that makes sense. And then there are other elements, like when Juliet turns round in the sanitarium and glares at Mrs. Rudge, and she has Olivia's eyes, and then Mrs. Rudge goes, oh my goodness, and has a heart attack,
right?
Because she recognizes her daughter. And I thought, right, okay, so she is possessed. But then you think, well, hang on, how does that work? How does the end work if she's possessed? How does the other deaths that happen in the film, how do they fit in?
Right.
How can when Magnus goes down into the basement, you see Olivia in the glass, which I presume you've noticed.
Yeah, I saw that yesterday.
Not everybody does, but, she's there. And you think, well, what does Magnus see? Because he turns round, doesn't he, on the staircase, and he goes, oh, and he's spooked by something and then falls over the stairwell. And you think, well,
and the other deaths.
Who turns off the light? Who shuts the door? I think, well, who's that? Because the Tom Conti one, you could say, well, that's just coincidence. There's a breeze, and and well, that's unfortunate. But it's the Magnus one where you really think, how does that fit in to the sort of narrative? And I think that is because that may be because, like I said, in the original version, he didn't die. Everything happens like he walks around the house, he prowls, he starts getting hot under the collar because there's Olivia or whatever, the sense of Olivia is there. He throws up in the bathroom, and then he leaves.
Right.
He leaves, drives off in his car, and just disappears from the story. It's never seen again.
Yeah, that's an odd thing to me.
Yeah.
No one notices that he's gone and rotting in her basement.
Yeah, exactly. And I think then when they showed it at Cannes, Magnus survived. That's it, because I was lucky enough to track down about 2 or 3 reviews from British film critics who saw the film at Cannes and then saw it when it was released in 1978. And they all referenced the fact that, hang on, Magnus didn't die when I sort of saw it first time round. And they mentioned that in their reviews. They say, what Alexander Walker, who's like a famous British film critic, he's no longer around, but he put Magnus has now been given a fate that suits his personality, you know, and I thought, right, okay. And then there's another article in a film magazine from the time that said, oh, the film's been changed since I last saw it, and now Magnus dies, you know, or words to that effect. And I thought, right, okay, so why did that happen then? You know, why did they change that? And nobody's ever been able to give me an answer on that. Richard hasn't. You know, interestingly, that was re-edited by a guy called Sean Barton, totally uncredited, who went on to do films like Return of the Jedi and sort of stuff like that. And I tracked him down on LinkedIn, and I spoke to him on the phone, and I said, right, didn't you re-edited this? I think Richard mentioned to me. And he said, yeah. He said, I was literally living in a flat above Richard at the time, and I'd edited some adverts or commercials, and so Richard said, oh, can you do a re-editing for me? And this was after Cancer. This was summer 77. And I said, well, do you remember what you actually did? And he said, I don't remember the ins and outs of it, but he said the main thing I remember is he said they needed me to edit in a scene of a person falling down the stairs and dying. And I thought, right, okay, so that's Magnus. That's Magnus. You know, because the David Swift death was always in there, you know, where he steps on the glass and falls over the stairwell.
Right.
That was always in there. And so I thought, I wonder why they filmed it, because that made me think maybe they had done reshoots. You know, somebody had said, right, you need to do something better with Magnus. And they'd gone back and done it. But everybody swears that they never had the money or the time to suddenly bring Keir back over for a day and whatever. So I thought, well, that's weird that they filmed it and then didn't use it. You know, that they filmed it and thought, actually, it's better if he just drives away. Yeah. Just sat on that stuff and then thought, no, actually, thinking about it, we will have him die. So yeah, it's one of those, because it's so long ago, Mark, nobody's ever going to be able to give me a proper answer. Right. Nobody's ever going to say, right, I can tell you exactly what happened there because I was there. And it's like, well, they're all there, but nobody can give me a definitive answer. But it's just one of the legends of the sort of film, really. But they're the things that I find fascinating. You know, that you can. There will always be something else I can find out about the film. You know, there will always be somebody else I can talk to about the film. You know, the Holy Grail will be to talk to Mia Farrow about it. I mean, she never spoke about the film. You know, it's almost like it never happened. Like she never did any press conferences or anything when the film came out, because they didn't have any money for marketing. Right. Peter Fetterman said that's why there's no blurbs, there's no stuff everywhere about the film, you know, because it was an independent film, so they couldn't push it. You know, when it came out in the UK, it was released in one cinema in London. You know, the Plaza in near Piccadilly Circus, one cinema. You know, it had a bigger release in France. It was much more successful in France because the French critics actually saw what Richard was trying to do, whereas the British critics were quite harsh on the film. There were some that sort of really liked it and said, this film is something different, you know, but the majority of the critics in Britain, when I read the reviews from 78, just sort of said, oh, this film doesn't make any sense. It's too slow. You know, it's too many hoary conventions, creaking staircases and this. And I thought, well, have you actually watched the film? You know, sort of, but the French critics raved about it. So it was a big success in France. So if you look for like marketing materials and stuff, because I'm always trying to hoover things up on eBay and things, you'll always find more French material. Yeah, I've noticed that. I've got a lobby card set from the British release, which I think must be the only set that was printed. Because I think if there was only one cinema show, right, what if they need multiple lobby card sets for? So I treasure that one, I can tell you, because I saw that once turn up at an auction site a few years ago, and I thought, right, I'm having that. You know, and whereas you see the French set come up quite a lot because it was quite a wide release. Yeah, I've seen those. Yeah, in fact, one of the guys that follows me on Twitter, a French gentleman called Claude, who is a screenwriter. He's done a few series that are on Netflix at the moment. And he saw Full Circle at the cinema in Paris in 78 when it was released. And he said he loved it so much he took his brother along the next day to see it again because he wanted, and he took his brother to say, you need to see this film. And so I thought, how cool is that? That there's a guy that actually literally went, and he kept the cuttings from the French newspapers when it came out, and he sent them to me. You know, he said, well, you want these more than I do. So he literally sent them to me.
Oh, that's awesome.
And it's like, how amazing is that he saw it, you know, when it came out.
Talking about the Magnus death scene made me think of how similar it is actually to the David Swift scene with them stumbling on stairs with bottles and they make it.
I thought you were going to say Black Christmas there because you said, you know, another. Keir Delay must have hated basements.
Yeah,
in the mid-70s, hated basement horror films in the mid-70s. It was like, not another basement.
Yeah.
For goodness sake, am I going to die down here? You know, sort of. Well, funnily enough, Keir.
Yeah.
You know, so.
But it made me think of a difference in the book where Julia has left these people shortly before they meet their demise.
Yeah,
so there's
David
kind
Swift,
of that angle of it too.
Isn't David Swift like stabbed in the book or
something? Yeah, it's not an accidental. It's not. It doesn't look like an accident.
She goes back to his house or something, or his flat, and he's laying on the ground and he's been stabbed or covered in blood or something, and you know it makes it out as though she's just stumbled across him.
Right, but it also makes it
he's actually done this herself or potentially. So
there's always a scene like she always comes running out and people notice her and she gets in her car and has an accident and they make it more as if she's crazy, she's exacting the revenge on all these people, either just on her own or like you say possessed by Olivia, and then again it's really streamlined and simplified in the movie, which I think the one element of the film that again, if I had to make change, because I love the film, but as I said, it is not perfect. I don't even know if there is such a thing as the perfect film, but the way Full Circle is, it's almost like there's an hour plus where it is very what they like to call deliberately paced. Where it's lots of scenes of Mia walking in the park. There's little visions and she's a pile of playing cards with Katie's face on them, and and all these scenes where there isn't much dialogue. Where Richard said, he said, the film lives and dies on Mia Farrow's face. Right.
Because there are so many scenes where there's no dialogue, and you're just looking at Mia. Looking at her eyes, looking at her face. Scenes where she's practically having a breakdown, and that's why I think that's why I'm thinking that everybody goes on about Mia Farrow in Rosemary's Baby. Take a look at this, because this performance is something else. This is one of the best female performances in a horror film I've ever seen. Because there is so much emotion in there. There are certain scenes that I watch even now, no matter how many times I've watched it, and I'll notice something different. This performance is sort of staggering, and I'm sorry, I've sort of gone off what you were asking.
No, that's okay.
I got so sort of caught up in my Mia Farrow fandom, because again, she doesn't really get thought of when people say. That's why, because I know you did a podcast very similar to a piece I did on my website.
Yeah. We talked about the same movies.
And I thought, again, it's, when you say to people, oh, well, what about See No Evil? Secret Ceremony, which is actually coming out on Blu-ray later this year.
Oh, wow.
In the UK through Indicator, I think, which is going to be like a worldwide first that's out on Blu-ray, and stuff, and it's just like nobody, because she just hadn't done any films. There seems to be so many actresses and people that just get forgotten about, but you say Mia Farrow to people and they just automatically say Rosemary's Baby. And,
or Woody Allen films,
which is a great film, which is when you talk about horror, but or the Woody,
right,
or just Woody Allen, full stop. But we have to do something to make people realise, that there is more than just Rosemary's Baby, and Full Circle is it, because a performance in it is deserves shouting about, and I just wish she would talk about it, because I've read, I think, 2 biographies/autobiographies of Mia Farrow, and they don't even mention Full Circle. It's literally not mentioned. And I'm like, well, how did that happen? Because it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And But I think she just had so much going on.
Right.
This was just something she sort of did. Oh, yeah, like she said, the words she said to Peter and Richard were, I'll give you 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I found out today, because I'd always had it, I saw a casting sheet for the film, thanks to one of the exec producers on it was a guy called Hugh Harlow, a sort of British guy who'd done exec producing stuff on Hammer films and stuff like that. But he is still around. He sort of linked me up to a casting call sheet, and it said Mia Farrow, and then it said, dash, please note, needed in theatre in November. And I was like, and that had always bugged me. And then literally today, I found out, and I just had to ring Richard about it, because I thought, how on earth was she doing this? That she was in a Royal Shakespeare Company production of Ivanov at the Aldwych Theatre in London from September to December 76. So literally, she was filming Full Circle in the day and then on stage in the evening in one of the main roles in this play.
Yeah.
With Bob Hoskins in it.
It could be a stressful time in her life, that she...
Just like, but can you imagine the workload? Richard, I said, like, that is one hell of a workload, especially when you consider the tone of Full Circle as a film. It's not exactly a laugh-a-minute comedy, is it? It's not a romp, and I thought, well, I doff my hat to you, Mia, because I thought for you to be able to do that, I don't know how somebody could do that, to be perfectly honest with you. And apparently she just had to have the odd night off here and there where an understudy had to fit in for when they did the night scenes. But, any scenes where it was in the day and that, she was doing that in the day and then going to the theatre in the evening. And I thought, well, I give you all the credit in the world for that.
And it could have been a rough time in her life personally because of all that work. And so it could just be a difficult time to think about.
Peter Hannan did suggest that to me when I spoke to him. But then, from what I've read about her time, at that time, that seemed to be a relatively good part, because she was with Andre Previn at the time and she seemed to be enjoying life, with him. So, it's just, I think it's just because things were so long ago, you're never going to get definitive answers because somebody's going to tell you one thing, somebody else says another, and you're like, well, who do I believe? It's just like, you just have to, when I wrote the magazine piece, some people were saying that the set was, Peter Fetterman said, the set was full of optimism and everybody was excited. And then you have Richard telling me he was waking up crying every day because he was under so much stress making it. And I thought, right, okay. So the only way you can report that is to say, well, this is what Peter Fetterman said, but this is what Richard said.
Right.
You just stand in the middle and say, well, I wasn't there, guys. I'm just going to say, this is what you're saying. I can't make a judgment call on this because I wasn't there. So, but it's a fascinating film to study. It's a fascinating film to watch. And I haven't regretted a single minute that I have spent researching it. The excitement you get when you find something new, as you may well have, Mark, with films that you are passionate about, especially if you find something and you think, hey, nobody else knows this. Nobody knows this. You'll find something in a research library. I found a trade magazine from the Cannes Film Festival a couple of months ago from May 77, and it had a full page ad in colour for Full Circle when it was having its press screening. And I think I put it on the Twitter feed actually, and I was like, I think I got into trouble actually because in the research library it's one of those no noise please. And I think when I turned the page of the magazine and there it was, I think I let out a yelp, and got a shush and some stares from people like, who is this person making noise in here? But I'm like, do you not realise? Look at this, it's a full page advert for Full Circle, and I've never seen it before. But I'm just mad. I'm just mad about it. But we get passionate about film.
Yeah,
it is a thing that so many people are passionate about, and especially genre films. I think, whether it be sci-fi or whatever, you take ownership of these, and with Full Circle, I've just been lucky for the fact that because of where I am.
Right.
I live in London, so let me go and stand outside the house where there was Mia Farrow's house in the film.
Yeah, at least you have a leg up there.
Exactly, and you literally come out of the house that they used for Mia's house, and literally 6 doors down is the entrance to Holland Park. You know, where they have all the scenes where she's with having the afternoon tea and where the kids are coming out to school and she sees Olivia. That was all filmed in the one park.
Yeah.
And so you can literally, you know, there's a horror film festival here in the UK every August that's brilliant called Fright Fest. I don't know if you've heard of it at all. But one of the guys that came over last year is a Swedish director called Christian, who had a film in the festival called Video Man, which I don't know if it's appeared in America, but it's definitely worth tracking down if you get it. It's a great film. And he connected with me and said one of his favourite films was Full Circle. And so he came over for Fright Fest as a guest, and I just met him and took him to Holland Park and walked him around. And said,
awesome.
You know, that's where that was filmed, that's where that was filmed. And I've got the film on my laptop, so I literally had the film playing while we were stood at the house. You know, and that was funny because when I did that, the cleaner came out, because Holland Park, where they filmed it, you'd need to have a fair bit of money in your bank account to buy a film, to buy a house there, put it that way. This woman came running out and said, you know, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, do you realise that 40 years ago, Mia Farrow was stood on those steps and they didn't know what I was talking about. Thought I was joking, I think. And I was like, look. And so I just literally showed them my laptop and look, there's the house. And they were like, wow, you know, and they got so excited about it, you know. But yeah, so, I mean, that's the beauty of film, isn't it? You know, you can always find out something new, always find a new location, always find somebody that was involved in it in some shape or form. And with Full Circle, there's still people I haven't tracked down or found. I'll be meeting Nigel Havers, I think, soon, because he's in theatre in London. He's the estate agent that sells Mia the house in the film. You know,
whose face you don't see.
Yeah, he's quite a well-known British actor. So that was his film debut. You know, when he's in there saying about, it's, you know, Arab money or something. It's like the United Nations around here or something. And she shuts the door on him and says, oh, charming, and sort of walks off.
Right.
You know, but I'll meet him and say, oh, do you remember this film Full Circle? No, I don't know what you're talking about. You know, it'll probably be the reaction. But yeah, so I don't know if there's anything else you need to ask me, Mark, but I'm enjoying talking to you.
I just wanted to, when you were talking about finding the Full Circle full page ad, it just made me think of two things that I love seeing in horror films, specifically, and just films in general. But one of them is a seance, which we have. And the other thing that I love is research. And she does both in the movie.
Yeah, you get 2 for the price of 1 in Full Circle.
I would have preferred if she had been looking at microfilm, but I will take the big bound.
Or a staple. A staple of 250 years ago, this massacre happened. Yeah. But you get 2 for the price of 1. And I just to go through those quickly in sequence. The seance bit. I think the seance is a brilliant scene because it doesn't overplay it.
Right. It doesn't do the typical.
Yes, right at the end, you get Damaris Heyman falling down the stairs, but the seance is played straight.
Right.
And it works so much better because of that. You get
nothing moves, no sounds.
The camera moving, the camera swooping around the table, close up of the face, people feeling uneasy. The soundtrack works really well. And it's just it's believable. I suppose that's the best way of describing it. Almost, it's believable. You know, whereas even in The Changeling, you have things flying through the air and stuff like that. You're like, oh, come on. Whereas in Full Circle, it just comes from Mrs. Flood reacting to Olivia's presence, and then everybody else getting uneasy regarding Mrs. Flood's reaction. You know, and it's just brilliantly done. I think it's maturely done. I just think it's a brilliant scene. I think it's a fantastic scene.
I really noticed that yesterday that it was subtle, very subtle as opposed to what we normally see, and I really appreciated that.
Exactly, because it's almost played not for laughs at all, but the start of it is almost a bit jokey, isn't it? Mark's having a few laughs with Mrs. Flood and doing it sort of about the silver and you know. That was one of the things that the time differences when I showed it to my wife, because you always have one of these desperate moments, and I think I put this on Twitter, there's something, especially if it's a film that you hold passionate, you show it to your other half and you say, look, you know, I'm going to put this film on, and it like means a lot to me, sort of thing. So you know, and so you're almost watching them more than you're watching the film. And she sort of said, you know, my wife liked it. She didn't obviously say, right, I'm going to devote the next 6 years to researching what shoes Tom Conti was wearing. Right. But she enjoyed it. So she was like, right, I can see why you like this, which I thought, well, that's good enough for me. But she laughs at the bit where Mrs. Flood, Mia says, can I get you some coffee? And Mia and Mrs. Flood says, oh, no, coffee. I can't have coffee. That's caffeine. You know, can I get some tea instead? And like Mark quite rightly said, he said, well, tea's got loads of caffeine in it as well. Yeah. You know, but which people didn't seem to realise at the time. Mm-hmm. You know, so you have that. But yeah, you have Mark joking with her, saying, "Oh, you know, are you going to be stealing the silver? Will they be stealing the silver? And you know, do we have?" And he's having a laugh. You should be charging double. You know, because she's joking back with him. And you think, oh, this is all quite light-hearted. And then Mark sits out, doesn't he? And then Julia sort of says, I'm sorry, I can't do this. Yeah. I'm going to sort of sit out as well by the fire. And then suddenly the mood changes. And, you know, what's interesting about when they filmed that as well was, because I've interviewed Damaris Heyman and Susan Porritt, who were the two ladies that turn up, you know, for the seance. And they both said that what they remembered about it was they had to film it a few times because Richard kept telling the actress that Anna Wing, who plays Mrs. Flood, to tone it down, because he said they kept saying she was too over the top, she was getting hysterical, and they said no, you know, dial it down, you know, that we don't need hysterics and arms throwing around, you know, and so and it works. Right. I think it works because it plays into everything else that Olivia, the ghost or the spirit of Olivia, is not one of these throwing plates against walls ghosts or presences. So I think the seance triggers that, you know, and I think it just fits in. I think it's brilliant, you know, especially when it's the pivotal scene of the film, really, because that's when, you know, and Mrs. Flood says, I can see a child, you know, and that sets Julia off. Right. You know, if the seance didn't happen, the rest of the story wouldn't have happened. Right. Arguably. So, you know, and then, like you said, you have the research scene, which is a staple of any good horror, isn't it, really? Yeah. And, but what I liked about that, and I know this might sound so insignificant that it's trivial, is that when she finds the story in the newspaper, it looks real. You know, because the amount of films you see, horror films, where suddenly this insignificant event in the grand scheme of things is suddenly the whole front page of the newspaper is about child was spotted falling out of a tree or something, you know, and it's like, why would they have used the whole front page of the paper for that? You know, and or the text around it just looks like somebody's photoshopped what they think is the front page of a newspaper together. You know, and it doesn't look anything like a newspaper, whereas this does. You know, and she goes through quite a few pages, and then she finds in it, it's just like one of the sidebar stories. Yeah, just a little blurb. Page, like child killed, found in Holland Park or whatever, you know, and it's a side story. You know, it's not the main story. And I thought, and it looks legit. You know, because I'm a journalist by trade. You know, that I used to work in newspapers, and so again, it might sound absolutely stupid, but that's one of the things I appreciated about the film. Where I thought when she's going through the newspapers, they actually look like real newspapers. They're aged, they're yellow. Department has knocked up something, you know, and you're thinking, well, hang on. If I look at the stories around, they're not even words; they're just Z, X, Z. You know, it's just a text around it. So yeah, I like that. That isn't filmed in the British Library, by the way. That was filmed in the Liberal Club, which is, again, just a members club in sort of London, which you can go and look around now, actually. So they have got a library in the Liberal Club, and that doubled up. They just dressed it up with a few more tables and chairs and stuff and passed it off as the British Library. But it isn't the British Library. Okay. And I think there's somebody else who makes, what's his name, that makes his film debut in that film. It's the gentleman that writes Downton Abbey. Yeah, what's his name? Oh my goodness.
I have never watched the show, but I know about it.
I can't remember his name. But literally the creator of Downton Abbey is the guy that plays the librarian.
Oh, how funny.
Julian Fellows.
Yes, I know who that is.
He plays the librarian.
Oh, my God, I didn't even notice that.
I'm sorry, we're closing in 10 minutes. That's Julian Fellows, a.k.a. Mr. Downton Abbey, who's doing quite well for himself at the moment, isn't he? Considering Downton Abbey's I think it's number 1 in the US, isn't it, at the box office?
Yep.
I think. So when we're recording this anyway. So, he's another one that's it. There's so many characters like that recognizable British stars, that might get lost on American audiences. But like Mr. Branscombe, who has the little tussle with Magnus in the front garden, is played by a guy called Peter Sallis, who was an incredibly popular British sitcom called Last of the Summer Wine. He was one of the lead characters in that. And also, I don't know if it's made it over the States, an animated, it's called Wallace and Gromit, which are like a Nick Park, these claymation, characters of a man and a dog.
Yeah.
That Peter Sallis did the voice of the man in that. And so when you see him in these films, and they just turn up for like 30 seconds or a minute, and you're like, oh, there's so many well-known British faces in there.
How funny.
Which obviously, I say, wouldn't necessarily mean much outside these shores, but it just adds to the sheen, I think, that there are so many good actors in small roles in the film for Mia to sort of bounce off. That it's not just her having to do all the work in this film. There's Edward Hardwicke, who plays like Captain Winter, she goes to see at the piano showroom. There's so many little scenes like that where they're almost stories within their own right. And great, just absolutely great.
You hit every question I had without me having to ask it, so that was great. Right. Well, I wish you all the luck, and when something happens, we'll have to talk again. Yeah, sure. I mean, as I say, you follow me on the Twitter, at @full_Julia, and I appreciate that because it's a lonely path. A lot of the time, there have been so many times where you just think, I'm not sure I can do this for much longer. How much longer can you just be banging your head against a brick wall or having doors shut in your face when it comes to Technicolor? But then something will happen, like today. It might sound crazy, but just this picture of Mia Farrow popped up and I thought, that's why I'm doing it. And I'm like, yes, here we go. I'm the juices are flowing here. I'm back in business. And that's when I then tracked down and found out about that she was on stage at the same time as making the film. And I get these little boosts, and when when Richard contacts you and says, oh, do you want to come round for coffee? It's like, that's a boost, because every time I go to see him, I'll chip away at something else and he'll remember something else, and I'll say, oh, well, what about, because there's just still so many things in the film that I can't answer, because I know from the research pretty much every scene that got cut after Cannes. As I said, there's the love scene, there's about 6 minutes different, because the running time at Cannes is listed as 103 minutes. And yet the film that we see on YouTube is 97. Right.
So we know 6 minutes went. So we know the backgammon scene went, we know the love scene went, and we know that Magnus dying got put in. And so there's elements, little bits like that. But there must have been other things that got changed, because, there's only 28 people listed in the cast at the end. So pretty much everybody that's listed as a cast member is somebody that had a part, rather than extras or somebody in the background. They had a part. And yet there's 2 people still listed in there as customers, a customer and a salesman, John Tinn, and I can't remember what the other one's, Bilton. And they're listed as salesman and customer. And I thought, where the hell are you? Where are you? Because I've Googled image pictures of them, and I thought, you are not in the film. You're not in. I thought the only place they could possibly be would be in the piano scene, that they're maybe in the background. But I thought, well, why would you list somebody in the cast if they're salesman and customer, And so I showed it to Richard, and he didn't, again, he just thought, I don't know what you're talking about. But I thought, well, they must have been in there, credited in the cast, and sadly they both died. So you can't ask them. But there's no mention of them in the script I saw or anything like that. So these are the sort of things that'll haunt me.
Yeah.
Do you see what I've done? Do you see what I've done there, Mark? That they will haunt me,
Yes.
and, because I know I'll probably never get an answer. The dream would be if I got a call from somebody and said, "Oh, we were going through our attic and we found this reel of film that says Full Circle Cannes 1977 on it," and I'd be like, but it isn't going to happen.
I can imagine you have dreams about these Absolutely. Discoveries on occasion.
Yeah, because people do find these things, And so I saw somebody recently found reels from like Halloween 5 or something, like with some the Man in Black scenes that got edited out at the end. Just the can got found in somebody's shed.
It happens all the time.
We're pushing it a bit to think somebody will have a reel of Full Circle.
You never know.
But yeah, you never know. And that's what keeps me going. You never know. You never know you'll find something. You never know that we will get it re-released and put out on Blu-ray. I'm positive we will. It just may take a long time, but I'm positive we will. I always take a step back and think, just imagine how amazing it will be if it gets released.
Right.
That's the thing. To have that screening, but to have it available, whoever releases it, and to be able to be able to see it and for sale somewhere and say, look, I did that.
Right.
I have played my part. This film should not have been forgotten. This film should be celebrated. People, horror fans, non-horror fans, should appreciate just how amazing this film is. And I've done my bit to push it to the front of the queue. And that's what keeps me going. So, and thanks for people like you that are helping. Everybody helps along the way, gives that little bit of publicity. We'll get there, and it'll be a team effort. Like Richard said about the making of the film, there are so many people. There's a guy called Guillaume in France that's helped me with a lot of stuff, that set up a Facebook page for the film. And so I connected with people via that. And as I say, Anya and yourself and, so many people, Jack, and it means a lot to so many people around the world that I owe it to everybody to keep going to try and get this over the line.
Well, I do wish you all the best. And you will have plenty of material for extras for the Blu-ray, for a book, possibly.
Well, I've been documenting a lot of the stuff of what I've been doing, because I think you could almost, if I'd have been a bit more switched on, I could have almost did one of these fan films of, me trying to get the film released, because this has been a crazy journey in its own right. Yeah, I just hope that we can get it out, and I hope I'm involved, and I hope when people do see it, even if they go and watch it on YouTube after listening to this, that if they do, I still think they'll be impressed, and then they become part of the journey, and we get it done.
And it's not too late to start documenting that now. So
no. Well, I have done some. I've got a YouTube channel. Some of the location videos that I've shot, I've put on there as well, and through some of the marketing stuff I've got.
I'll link that and your Twitter handle and anything else that you want me to link. I'm saying this as if this is going to get a lot of exposure for you, but I'll link it on my show notes for the episode. Facebook page, you can send me that link. I'll add that, and the YouTube channel. So, and anything else you want to send me.
I just hope I haven't bored anybody, Mark, because I have rattled on. I know that, but I'm hoping that the passion I have for the film has come across. I hope if people do go and say, well, actually, if it's on YouTube, I'll give it a spin.
Right.
That if they watch it, they then understand why I and to an extent you as well are so passionate about the film. So,
this kind of research is it's fascinating to me, if nothing else, and it's like those scenes in the movies that really, this journey is very interesting to hear about. So I really appreciate you coming on the show.
No, I've enjoyed it, and I shall keep you posted on any developments, and say hopefully some people will listen to this and it'll inspire them to watch the film, and then they become part of the journey. As well. So thanks for that, Mark. I've really enjoyed it.
And why don't you give your the Twitter handle again?
_Julia, isn't it? I think because I had to find a way of doing it, because obviously when I say Full Circle, some people in America they don't know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Whereas when you say The Haunting of Julia, they're like, right, okay. And interestingly enough, Richard had no Richard and Peter Federman had no say in it being called The Haunting of Julia. That was down to a guy called John Allen Simon, who bought the rights to release it in America in 1981.
Yeah, 3 years later.
Yeah, because I know I'm going back on again here, so I shall keep this incredibly short. Peter took the film to America to try and get it released in America in 1978. And he said he met with executives, I think it was for Paramount, and he showed it to them, and he said they walked out after 10 minutes.
Ooh. Because
they said it was, quote unquote, too slow, which I thought, well, hang on, 10 minutes, that must mean they literally walked out after the choking scene. And I thought, that's too slow? And I thought, but he said, he said that all he heard from studios in the US and distributors in the US was it was too slow and not gory enough.
Yeah.
Because when he was trying to get it released, suddenly it was, I know Halloween isn't gory, but the slasher film was starting to come in. And suddenly we were getting, The Omen had been really successful. And suddenly we were just about to get Friday the 13th and everything else. And suddenly, that was what they wanted. So when you take this very adult, very mature, very slow at times, almost like an art house horror film. It's not far from being an art film at times, that people were just watching it and saying, well, how are we going to get people to go and watch this? And so it never got released. And then it was only then this John Allen Simon and his company called Discovery Films who were deliberately looking for films that hadn't been released. So, for example, one of the films that his company released was The Wicker Man in the States, because that had never got released first time round for similar reasons. If you think The Wicker Man is too slow and nothing really happens, you obviously haven't watched it all the way through. So he stumbled across Full Circle and said, well, hang on, this hasn't been released in America, I'll release it. But he was the one that said, right, I don't want it to be called Full Circle because nobody knows it's a horror film if you say Full Circle.
Right.
So I'm retitling it The Haunting of Julia. And Richard had no say in that whatsoever. I think Peter just sort of said, well, if it means you're releasing it in America, do what you want. And so that's why obviously most people seem to know it as The Haunting of Julia rather than Full Circle. I don't know if I understand it. I hate the American poster. I hate it.
Oh, really?
Because it's like Olivia on it. And, we've talked about God knows how long we've been talking now, but we've been talking about the film is ambiguous. Is she mad?
Right.
Possessed? Is she suicidal? Is she just grief-stricken? Is there a ghost? Isn't there? And you have this American poster with a huge drawing of Olivia with she's had nobody to play with for 30 years. Yeah. And it's just like, oh, right, okay, so we're getting rid of all the ambiguity and we're just selling this as a demonic child film.
Right.
And I thought, well, that's just, so the title I can live with, because I think, well, that's not bad. But I just think personally, the poster is just at odds. Interestingly, I showed the poster to Samantha Gates, who plays Olivia in the film. She's now a chef, or a food critic / chef, and I've interviewed her, and because she was the one. I don't know if you saw this, but magnificently, she sent me a photograph of her and Mia on set that was taken by her mum, like a Polaroid. She gave it to me, and I thought this is absolutely fantastic because it's like between takes with them laughing.
Oh yeah, I did see that.
And I thought, well, how great is this when she sent me this? And I showed her the American poster, and she was like, "Is that meant to be me?" And she said, "It looks nothing like me." But there we go. I've gone off on a tangent again.
That's all right. I do it all the time.
I'm just passionate about the film. So I hope people have found it a bit entertaining. It's been great talking to you, and hopefully some people will connect with me down the line, having given this a listen.
Yes, and once again, thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, Simon.
I really enjoyed it.
Hello, this is Chris Haskell from They Live by Film. For those that don't know us, Adam, Zach, and we built a podcast over the last 2 years that's a combination of film discussion from 3 very different perspectives, as well as industry interviews with the leaders in boutique Blu-ray and 4K community. We started with Deaf Crocodile, but over time we've been lucky enough to speak with Arrow Video, Severin, Mondo Macabro, Vinegar Syndrome, Radiance, Indicator, most of the OCN partner labels. It's been a blast. You can find us wherever you podcast, and also actually recently as part of Someone's Favorite Production Podcast Network. We hope to see you online.
Thank you so much for listening to these special report episodes.